The autumn sun dipped low, painting the skies in dusky orange as the bell of Hollow Creek rang from the small wooden chapel at the center of town. The sound echoed down dirt streets lined with weathered storefronts and hitching posts, where horses shifted impatiently as if a 2-cent change riding in with the cooling air. Folks in Hollow Creek said the bell had 2 voices, one for Sunday prayers and one for warning. Tonight, its toll carried the weight of the latter, though no one dared whisper why aloud. The year was 1878, and though the railroad had begun pushing steel teeth through distant plains, Hollow Creek still clung to its old ways. Wooden homes leaned against the prairie wind, oil lamps flickered in windows, and wagons rattled slowly along the worn trails. Life here was steady, simple. Yet beneath the surface, the land whispered of tension. Traders passing through told of cattlemen feuding over water rights, of outlaws slipping into the hills, and of uneasy peace between the settlers and the Apache who had long called the land their own. On the porch of a whitewashed boarding house, a young woman sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap though her heart drummed against her ribs. She wore a plain calico dress, pressed so neat that not a wrinkle dared show, yet her eyes betrayed unrest. Everyone in town knew she was promised to a man of means, a man her father said would secure her future, a man who walked with boots polished as mirrors, whose smile never reached his eyes. She was told it was for her own good, but the promise felt more like a noose tightening around her neck. The air grew heavy with the scent of dust and wood smoke as she lifted her gaze toward the hills where shadows deepened among the pines. Rumors always swirled about those hills and about the figures who rode silently across the ridges at dusk. Children whispered of painted warriors watching with eyes like hawks, of figures moving as if part of the wind itself. The grown folk dismissed such talk, though when they bolted doors at night, they too cast wary looks toward the darkening horizon. That evening, as townsfolk gathered for supper or hushed talk inside the saloon, a lone rider approached from the west. His horse carried the lean strength of the wild, hooves silent against the earth, its breath visible in the cooling air. The man astride it was unlike the ranchers or drifters who sometimes passed through Hollow Creek. His hair was long, his bearing proud, and his eyes sharp as flint, watching every corner as if measuring both danger and opportunity. The few who glimpsed him from behind curtains whispered one word Apache. To some, that word was enough to stir fear. To others, it carried a strange fascination. The people of Hollow Creek lived by a brittle peace with the Apache, a peace often spoken of but rarely trusted. But no one could deny the rider's presence held gravity, as though the land itself bowed beneath his shadow. He dismounted at the edge of town, where the lamplight flickered faint against the growing dark, and waited, silent as stone. The young woman on the boarding-house porch felt it before she saw him, a weight, a pull, something stirring deep in her chest. When her eyes met his across the dusty street, the noise of town life seemed to fall away. For a heartbeat, she forgot the man she was promised to, the father who had sealed her fate with a handshake, the wedding that loomed like a storm on the horizon. Instead, all she felt was the certainty in the Apache's gaze, as though he knew her secret struggle without her ever speaking it aloud. But the spell broke quickly, for heavy footsteps echoed behind her. The man who claimed her as his bride-to-be stepped out of the saloon, his figure casting a long shadow in the lamplight. His hand rested casually on the butt of his revolver, his mouth curled in a smile that looked more like possession than affection. He greeted the gathering crowd with smooth words, but his eyes cut toward the Apache rider with a glint of challenge. The street grew tense as eyes flicked between the two men, one polished by wealth and power, the other honed by wilderness and quiet strength. Neither spoke, yet the air trembled with what was unsaid. And in the center of it all, the young woman sat frozen, her future hanging like a lantern in the dark. Swaying with the threat of wind, she could feel it. Choices were being made, paths laid out before her that she had never asked to walk. The promise of a forced marriage pressed down like chains. And yet, across the street, the Apache's gaze carried something different. Not gentleness, but a vow forged of fire and earth. A vow she could not yet name, but one that already bound her in ways she did not understand. The bell of Hollow Creek rang again, sharp against the night, as if the town itself knew that nothing would ever be the same after this moment. And as the Apache finally spoke, his voice steady and low, every ear strained to hear the words that would shift the fate of them all. I will not let him take you. I'll save you from this marriage. But in the end, you will be my wife. The crowd gasped, the groom-to-be's hand tightened on his weapon, and the young woman's breath caught in her throat. For in that single vow, everything she thought. She knew about her future shattered, and a new destiny began to stir in the dust of Hollow Creek. The night air grew colder, silence thick as the stars wheeled above. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, long and haunting, as if marking the birth of something both dangerous and inevitable. And in that moment, no one in Hollow Creek could tell whether salvation or ruin had just been promised. The street was hushed, the silence so sharp that even the horses tethered outside the saloon shifted nervously, stamping the dust as if they sensed danger rising in the air. The young woman's breath caught in her chest, her eyes darting between the two men, the suitor her father had chosen for her and the Apache who had spoken words no one else in Hollow Creek would have dared to utter aloud. A vow like that was not a thing to be thrown lightly into the night air, not in a town where whispers could turn to fire before morning. Her father had always told her that promises were the only currency worth more than gold. A man's word, once given, could shape lives, ruin families, or bring peace between enemies. But she had never thought a stranger's vow, made in front of the whole town, would weigh heavier than the ink of her father's own agreements. She sat frozen on the porch, her hands twisting in her lap, while the townsfolk's murmurs began to ripple. Some looked to her suitor, expecting his wrath. Others looked to the Apache, wondering if his boldness meant war was closer than they'd feared. The suitor's polished boots rang against the wooden boards as he stepped closer. His smile never faltered, but it sharpened, cutting thin as a knife. He tipped his hat in mock respect, though the gesture carried more threat than courtesy. His voice, smooth and honeyed, carried easily down the street. This town doesn't take kindly to wild men making claims they can't keep. Best you ride on before you find yourself on the wrong end of the law. But the Apache didn't flinch. His horse stood steady at his back, its muscles taut, its ears flicking at the tension. His dark eyes stayed locked on hers, and though he said no more, she felt the weight of his vow pressing on her, more real than the ring her suitor had slipped on her finger weeks before. It was not a promise of gentleness. It was a vow made of stone and blood, and something inside her stirred at it, torn between fear and something else she dared not name. The sheriff finally stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, but his voice worn with weariness. He was a man too long used to balancing the temper of ranchers and the edge of frontier justice. "That's enough for tonight," he said gruffly. "The girl's business is family business, and family business don't concern the town square." His eyes flicked to the Apache, then back to the suitor. "Take it inside. We don't need blood in the street." The Apache gave the sheriff a long, unreadable look before he mounted his horse once more. For a moment, the crowd thought he might turn and ride away, but instead he guided the horse only a few steps before pausing. He spoke low, the words carrying like smoke in the stillness. "The land remembers truth, even when men forget. She is not his." Then he tugged the reins, and the horse moved with a steady rhythm into the shadows at the edge of town. Only when he vanished into the line of dark pines did the townsfolk release their held breath. The suitor's jaw tightened, his pride pricked raw before so many eyes. He turned to the girl with that same cold smile, but there was a flash of steel beneath it now. "Best you remember who you belong to," he whispered harshly, though his arm around her shoulder looked tender to anyone watching. That night, the town couldn't stop buzzing. The saloon filled with speculation, the boarding house with hushed voices behind doors. Some said the Apache's words meant the old treaties were breaking. Others muttered that the girl had somehow brought this on herself, as if she had called him down from the mountains with nothing more than her restless heart. And yet, none could deny the tension clinging to Hollow Creek like smoke. She lay awake in her small room, the oil lamp flickering low on her bedside table. The shadows on the wall seemed longer than they had the night before, stretching like fingers across the boards. She thought of her suitor, of the way he claimed her future as though she were another piece of land to be fenced and branded. And then she thought of the Apache, of the sharp strength in his vow, of the strange sense that he had seen straight through her, past her practiced smile and her carefully folded hands. When morning broke, the town moved slower, the weight of the night still heavy. The blacksmith hammered with less rhythm, the storekeeper spoke in hushed tones, and even the church bell rang softer. The suitor strode confidently down the main street, tipping his hat to townsfolk as though nothing had been unsettled. He spoke of wedding preparations with smooth assurance, making promises of fine clothes, silver, and a home on the edge of town where she would live comfortably. To anyone listening, it sounded like certainty. To her, it sounded like a cage. She longed to escape the talk, so she wandered out past the last houses where the prairie began to stretch wide. The grasses swayed, the sky opened, and the air smelled of earth and pine. For a brief moment, she could breathe again, though her heart still carried the weight of unseen chains. As she walked, she thought she heard the faint echo of hooves far off, and when she looked toward the hills, she swore she saw a shadow move along the ridge, too steady and sure to be a trick of light. The Apache had not left. She knew it without needing proof. He lingered, watching, waiting. For what, she could not say. But she felt that her life was no longer her own to decide. Something larger had stepped in, something born of vows and promises that could not be undone. As days passed, Hollow Creek shifted uneasily. Ranchers began to arm themselves more heavily. Whispers of Apache camps moving closer reached the saloon, and the sheriff rode out more often, though no one knew what he found. Each night she heard coyotes howl, their cries carrying across the valley like a reminder that the wilderness was always closer than the town dared admit. Her suitor grew sharper with each passing day, his charm turning brittle, his smile stretched too thin. He spoke often of control, of how a man must take what is his or be left with nothing. He boasted loudly, yet his eyes flicked often toward the hills where shadows lingered. He hated what he could not command, and she began to realize he hated her most of all when her gaze drifted somewhere beyond his reach. The Apache appeared again one evening, though not in the street. She saw him at the edge of the woods when she had slipped out for air, his figure half hidden among the trees. He said nothing at first, only watched, his presence as steady as the earth. And though fear prickled her skin, she did not run. At last he spoke, his words low but certain. "He will bind you, and the chains will cut deep. But I have spoken, and the land has heard. You are not his to keep." Her breath trembled, her hands twisting in her skirt. "You don't understand," she whispered. "My father has given his word. The whole town expects it. I have no choice." His gaze did not waver. "There is always a choice. Some are only harder to bear." Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps approached, and the suitor's voice called her name, sharp and accusing. She turned, startled, and when she looked back, The Apache was gone, swallowed into the shadows as if he had never been there, but his vow lingered in her ears, stronger than the ring on her finger, stronger than the weight of her father's commands. She walked back into town with her suitor, but her thoughts were no longer wholly her own. Hollow Creek waited, tense as a bowstring pulled too tight. The townsfolk felt it in their bones, the sense that something unseen was about to break. And the girl, caught between two vows she had never asked for, knew the moment was coming when she would no longer be able to hide behind silence. For when a man of wealth claimed her with law and paper, and an Apache vowed her with earth and blood, the question of who she truly belonged to could not remain unanswered forever. The prairie wind whispered through the night, carrying with it the scent of pine and smoke, and in the distance a coyote called again, as if reminding her that her fate was already set into motion. The days in Hollow Creek grew heavier with each passing sunrise, as if the whole town was holding its breath for something they could not name. The young woman felt it most of all. Every morning she awoke with the sound of the chapel bell, and every night she lay restless, staring at the ceiling while shadows crept along the walls. The vows spoken in the street still rang in her mind, the smooth, practiced promises of the man her father had chosen for her, and the raw, unyielding words of the Apache, spoken like a thunderclap that no one could forget. Her father grew more insistent as the wedding day approached. He reminded her that security did not come from love but from stability. He spoke of land, cattle, and alliances that would keep their family respected. To him, marriage was another business deal, and her role in it was no more than a signature. At the bottom of the page, she wanted to protest, to say that she was not a bargaining piece to be traded away, but each time she opened her mouth, she saw the hard lines of her father's face and felt her words shrivel before they reached her suitor, though was more difficult to endure. He paraded through town with polished boots and easy laughter, convincing everyone he was a man of charm and vision. But when they were alone, she saw the steel in his eyes, the way his grip on her arm tightened as if she might vanish if he didn't hold fast. He told her he would make her life easy, that she'd never want for food or clothing or shelter. Yet in his voice she heard possession, not care. He never asked what she wanted. He only told her what would be in the shadows of the pine ridges. The Apache lingered. Some nights she thought she saw his silhouette against the moonlit hills, and some mornings she found signs, a horse's track in the soft earth near the creek, or an arrowhead resting sharp and silent against a stone. She never spoke of it to anyone, but deep down she knew those signs were left not by accident, but by intent. He was near, and he was watching. The town itself shifted with unease. Ranchers whispered about cattle missing near the edges of their land. Traders spoke of camps seen along the river, fires burning where none had been before. Mothers hushed their children earlier each night, warning them to stay inside. Hollow Creek had always been a place balanced on the edge between wilderness and civilization, but now it felt like the balance was tipping. The sheriff, worn by years of keeping peace, grew more watchful. He walked slower down the street, his hand never straying far from his gun. He reminded folks that trouble brewed fastest when men fed it with fear. But even his steady words couldn't smooth the worry that ran like water beneath every conversation. The girls' days blurred into one another, each one bringing her closer to a wedding she dreaded and a vow she did not understand. She tried to imagine her life beyond that moment, to picture herself in the house her suitor promised, dressed in fine clothes, with silver on the table. Yet each time she tried, the picture felt lifeless, like a painting with colors too dull to stir the heart. One evening, unable to bear the walls of the boarding house, she walked toward the edge of town, where the prairie stretched wide beneath a rising moon. She stood there in the quiet, the grass brushing her skirts, the sky endless above. And then she heard it, the soft rhythm of hooves, steady and sure. She turned, and there he was, the Apache, his horse moving like a shadow between earth and sky. He dismounted without a word, his presence filling the space around her like a storm that had not yet broken. For a long moment neither spoke. She wanted to ask why he had said those words in front of the whole town, why he had tied her fate to his vow without her consent. But the questions tangled on her tongue, heavy with fear and curiosity alike. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. He does not see you. He sees only what you give him, your father's name, your hand, your silence. But you are more than that. And I will not let him bind you to chains. Her heart pounded, though she tried to steady it. You don't know me, she whispered. You don't know what my father demands. You don't know what it costs to go against him. He shook his head, his gaze unwavering. I know enough. I know the land does not lie. I know when a heart beats against its cage. And I know a vow once spoken cannot be broken. His words burned inside her, frightening and strange, yet also carrying a kind of truth she could not deny. Still, she turned away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. You don't understand. In this town, a woman has no choice. He stepped closer, but not with the force of a man claiming. His voice softened, though it carried the weight of the hills behind it. Then you must make one, even if it breaks the world around you. Before she could answer, the sound of laughter drifted on the wind, sharp and mocking. She froze, and so did he. Her suitor's voice carried from the path behind, and within moments he appeared with two men at his side, both armed and grinning as if they'd stumbled upon prey. Well, well, the suitor drawled, his eyes glittering. In the moonlight. No wonder you've been restless. I should have guessed it wasn't the heat keeping you awake at night. His companions chuckled, but the girl's stomach knotted with dread. The Apache stood tall, silent, his eyes hard as stone. The suitor stepped forward, his hand resting on his revolver. This town is mine, and so is she. Don't think your shadows or your hills give you any claim here. You'll leave or you'll bleed. The night stretched taut, the prairie wind carrying the weight of unspoken violence. The girl wanted to cry out, to plead with them to stop, but her voice was trapped in her chest. The Apache's horse shifted, the air filled with the sound of leather creaking and metal faintly rattling. The suitor's men grinned wider, eager for what might come, but nothing happened. Not yet. The Apache's voice broke the silence, calm but sharp. This is not your land. This is not your law. And she is not yours. The suitor's smile faltered for just a heartbeat, though he quickly masked it with arrogance. He waved his men back, his voice dripping with false ease. For now let him think he's won, he said, turning his gaze to the girl. But don't forget, your father has already sold your hand. And when the day comes, no wild man will stop it. With that, he turned, his boots grinding against the dirt, his men following close behind. Their laughter faded into the night, but the unease they left behind clung like smoke. The girl stood trembling, caught between fear and relief, while the Apache watched the shadows where they had vanished. He said nothing more, only mounted his horse and rode back toward the hills, leaving her alone in the stillness. Yet his vow hung in the air, stronger than ever. From that night on, she knew there was no returning to the life she had once accepted. The town buzzed with rumors, the suitor grew more dangerous in his pride, and her father pressed harder for obedience. But deep within, a seed had taken root, a small, burning defiance that no promise of silver or comfort could smother. And though she could not say why, she felt certain the next time the Apache rode into Hollow Creek, the choice she had tried so hard to avoid would no longer be hers to postpone. The prairie waited, wide and restless, the land itself holding its breath for what was to come. The days marched forward with a weight that pressed against every soul in Hollow Creek. The autumn air grew sharper, the wind carrying the smell of pine and smoke, as if the land itself was warning of what was coming. The wedding date loomed nearer, and though the chapel bell had not yet tolled for her vows, each ring for Sunday prayer felt like a cruel rehearsal. The young woman carried herself through the streets with lowered eyes, though whispers followed her wherever she went. Some townsfolk said she was cursed, that the Apache had marked her the night he made his vow in the street. Others claimed she had bewitched him, that no man of the hills would bind himself so fiercely unless a spell had been cast. She bore their looks in silence, her heart split between dread and an unfamiliar pull that grew stronger each time she thought of the words he had spoken. Her suitor moved through town with renewed pride, as though each rumor only fueled his determination to prove his claim. He spoke of the wedding as though it were already behind them, of the fine house he was preparing, of the guests who would travel from neighboring towns to witness the union. He boasted loudly in the saloon that no savage could undo the plans of a man with money, law, and the girl's own father on his side. The laughter of his companions carried down the street, but underneath it lay an unease they all felt. Her father became more restless as the day approached. He polished his boots, straightened his coat, and spent long evenings speaking in low tones with the suitor. He did not look her in the eye as often, as if he feared what he might see there. For him, this marriage was not about love or happiness. It was about security, about keeping the family standing in a world that could shift as suddenly as a prairie storm. And yet, even he seemed troubled by the tension mounting in town. The sheriff's presence grew heavier. He watched the saloon, he walked the streets at dusk, and he often rode to the edge of the hills. But no matter how far he went, the Apache was always one step beyond his reach. Signs of his presence lingered: ashes of campfires still warm, hoof prints near the creek, and arrows left sharp in tree trunks. The sheriff muttered that this was no ordinary game of cat and mouse. This was a man waiting for his moment. The girls' nights were the hardest. Sleep came in fits, broken by dreams where the chapel bell rang louder and louder until it drowned her. In those dreams she would turn and find the suitor standing beside her, smiling with cold triumph. But beyond him, in the shadows, the Apache waited, silent, his vow still ringing in her ears. When she woke, her heart pounded, and she could not shake the feeling that the dream was more a warning than a vision. As the wedding neared, preparations filled the town. Women stitched dresses, children practiced hymns, and men hung lanterns along the main street. The whole town seemed bent on dressing itself in celebration, though beneath the surface everyone felt the same tightness in their chest. Even the bedust. Laughter of the children seemed strained, like they too sensed something they could not name. The girl went about her days as though she were walking to the gallows. She tried to quiet her thoughts, to imagine herself in the role expected of her, a dutiful wife, a silent partner in her suitor's plans. Yet every time she looked toward the hills, every time she caught the faint glimmer of movement among the pines, her resolve weakened. She wondered if the Apache was watching her, if he was waiting for her to choose, or if the choice had already been made for her by his vow. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in fire, she found herself again at the edge of the prairie. The grasses swayed, the air chilled, and from the shadows he emerged. His horse moved quietly, and he dismounted, his presence steady and unshaken. "You should not be here," she whispered, fear pricking at her voice. "If they see you—" "They already see me," he interrupted, his voice firm. "They watch their hills. They sharpen their guns. They wait for a fight they do not understand." Her breath trembled. "Why do you keep coming? Why did you make that vow?" He held her gaze, his words slow and certain. "Because truth cannot be buried under lies. He thinks you are his because a paper says so. But the land, the wind, the fire, they do not lie. They know where you belong." His words frightened her, but they also stirred something deep inside. She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. You don't know what he will do. He is not a man who forgives insult. He will bring others, and they will come for you. I am not afraid of him, he said simply, but you are. Her lips parted, but she could not answer. He was right. Fear gripped her every moment, pressing down like iron chains. She wanted to tell him to leave, to vanish into the hills and never return. Yet when she opened her mouth, no such words came. Instead, her silence betrayed her, and he seemed to read in it the truth she could not speak. Before more could be said, the distant sound of hoofbeats broke the air. Both of them turned sharply. Lanterns flickered in the distance, voices carrying harsh and mocking. The suitor was coming, and he was not alone. The girl's stomach dropped, terror gripping her. The Apache's eyes narrowed, his hand resting lightly on his horse's mane. Go, he said. Return before they see you. But she hesitated, torn, until his voice grew sharper. Now. She ran, her skirts heavy against her legs, heart pounding as the voices drew closer. She did not look back, though she longed to. She reached the boarding house breathless, her chest burning, and collapsed against the door. Behind her, out in the dark, the echoes of confrontation loomed out. The next morning, Hollow Creek was alive with whispers. Some said shots had been fired in the hills. Others swore they'd seen the Apache's horse galloping across the ridge, the suitor chasing with men at his side. No one knew for certain what had happened, but the air carried the edge of violence, sharp and biting. The girl heard it all, her hands trembling as she poured water from the pump, her mind racing with what might have unfolded in the night. Her suitor returned later that day, his clothes dusty, his temper sharp. He said nothing of the chase, but his eyes burned with rage whenever they landed on her. He gripped her arm harder than before, his voice low and cutting. You think he can protect you? He can't. I'll crush him, and when I do, you'll stand at my side and watch. Then you'll know who you belong to. She flinched at his words, her heart hammering with dread. Yet beneath the fear, something new flickered. A stubborn spark, a resistance she had not known she possessed. The wedding day drew nearer. The chapel was adorned with fresh flowers, the pews polished, the lanterns hung high. The whole town prepared to witness the binding of vows, believing it would settle the unease that had spread through their streets. But beneath their prayers and their hymns, the tension throbbed like a wound that would not heal. The girl stood before her mirror in the boarding house, staring at the white dress laid across the bed. Her hands shook as she touched the fabric, her reflection pale and hollow. Outside, the chapel bell began to toll, its voice carrying through the town. Each ring felt like the strike of a hammer, counting down to her fate. She looked once more toward the window, toward the hills rising beyond the town. Her heart pounded with the memory of his vow, of the certainty in his eyes, of the words that had bound her even as she tried to deny them. And in that moment, with the bell still ringing, she knew the climax was upon her. The suitor waited, the town gathered, and somewhere in the shadows, the Apache was watching. The choice was no longer hers to avoid. It would be forced into the open, and when it came, Hollow Creek would never be the same again. The bell tolled louder, echoing through the streets, each ring striking deeper into her chest. The moment had come, and the storm was ready to break. The chapel bell rang over Hollow Creek, its solemn notes rolling across the prairie. Each toll seemed to press harder against the young woman's chest as she walked through the crowded street. Lanterns swayed from the rafters, flowers trailed from the windows, and townsfolk gathered in their best clothes, whispering behind their hands. Her white dress, carefully sewn and pressed, felt more like chains than fabric. Every step she took toward the chapel felt like she was walking deeper into a trap. Her suitor stood tall at the entrance, Dressed in his finest, a smile painted across his face. He offered his hand as if nothing in the world could touch his certainty. Behind him, her father looked proud, though his eyes held the weight of worry he could not hide. The sheriff lingered nearby, his jaw set, his gaze sharp, as if he, too, expected something more than vows to be spoken this day. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The pews creaked as neighbors leaned forward, eager to witness the moment. Some watched with joy, others with unease, for though the flowers and hymns painted a picture of celebration, beneath it all ran the memory of a vow spoken in the dark one. That still hung like a storm over the town. She stood at the front, her hands trembling, her heart pounding loud enough she was sure the whole chapel could hear it. The preacher opened his book, his voice steady as he began to speak the familiar words. Her suitor's hand clutched hers, firm and unyielding, a grip that told her more than his smile ever could. He leaned close, his whisper sharp. Say the words, seal it, and this is done. Her throat tightened, her breath catching. She tried to form the words, but they felt heavy, foreign, like stones in her mouth. The preacher's voice droned on, the congregation shifting restlessly. The moment stretched, fragile and tense. And then, before she could answer, the doors of the chapel burst open. A gust of wind swept through, scattering petals and rattling the lanterns. Gasps filled the room as every head turned. Framed in the doorway stood the Apache, tall and unflinching. His dark eyes steady, his presence filling the space as surely as thunder fills the sky. Behind him, the prairie light blazed, casting his figure in shadow and fire. For a long moment, no one moved. The suitor's smile faltered, his hand tightening like a vice. The girl's heart leapt, though fear and hope warred within her. The preacher stammered, his voice fading as silence overtook the chapel. The Apache's words broke that silence, calm but carrying the weight of truth. She is not his. Chaos erupted. Voices shouted, men rose from the pews, the sheriff barked for order. The suitor drew his revolver, fury flashing in his eyes. He shoved the girl behind him, his face twisted with rage. You've gone too far, he spat. This ends here. But before he could raise the gun, the sheriff stepped forward, his own hand firm on his weapon. Enough, he thundered, his voice ringing louder than the bell. No blood in this house, not today. The suitor's chest heaved, his finger twitching on the trigger, but the sheriff's steady gaze held him. The townsfolk murmured, there. Fear mixing with curiosity, their eyes darting between the suitor, the Apache, and the girl caught in the middle. The Apache's voice rose again, steady as stone. This is not a matter of guns. It is a matter of truth. A vow was spoken, and it cannot be broken by paper or law. She belongs to no man's claim but her own. The girl's breath caught, her heart pounding in her ears. For the first time, she felt all eyes turned to her, not as a pawn, not as a prize, but as the one whose choice mattered most. The preacher's book hung open in his hands. The sheriff's jaw clenched, the suitor's rage burned hot, but in the silence that followed, she realized the moment was hers. Her hand shook as she stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. I cannot say the words, she whispered. Not to bind myself to chains, not to live a life that is not mine. Gasps rippled through the room, her father's face paling, the suitor's fury boiling over. He lunged, grabbing her arm, his voice a snarl. You think you can shame me in front of them all? You will regret this. But the sheriff's hand clamped down on his shoulder, pulling him back. That's enough, the lawman growled. You've had your say. Now she's had hers. The suitor struggled, but the sheriff held firm, the weight of the town's eyes turning against the man who had thought himself untouchable. For the first time, the girl saw fear flicker behind his anger, the fear of a man losing control. She stepped back, closer to the Apache, though he did not reach for her. He simply stood, steady, his vow already spoken, his presence a promise stronger than words. The congregation watched in silence, the truth settling over them like dust after a storm. Her father lowered his head, the fight draining from him. He saw in her eyes what he had long refused to see, the quiet strength, the will that had been smothered but not broken. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, heavy with resignation. "Then so be it. Let her choose her own path." The suitor cursed, his pride shattered, but the sheriff let him out, his protests echoing down the street. The townsfolk whispered, their faces a mixture of shock and relief. The preacher closed his book, the flowers wilting under the weight of what had passed. The girl stood in the center of it all, her chest rising with each trembling breath. The chapel, once a place of confinement, now felt like a door flung wide open. She turned to the Apache, their eyes meeting, and for the first time she did not look away. His vow had been bold, unyielding, but now it was no longer just his it. Was hers as well. In the days that followed, Hollow Creek changed. The suitor left town in disgrace, his name whispered only in cautionary tones. Her father, though still stern, softened, learning at last that his daughter's strength was not a weakness to be bartered away. The sheriff kept watch, but his eyes held less weariness, as though a burden had lifted. The girl walked through the streets no longer bowed by whispers. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her gaze steady, her heart lighter. The townsfolk, once quick to judge, now watched her with respect, for they had seen her stand in the face of chains and refuse them. The Apache came and went with the wind, sometimes seen on the ridge, sometimes gone for weeks. Yet she knew his vow remained as constant as the land itself. When he returned, he did not speak of ownership, but of choice. And together they began to shape a life not bound by fear, but by truth. The prairie stretched wide around them, hills rising strong, the sky endless above. Hollow Creek, once a town on edge, settled into its new rhythm. And though the memory of that day in the chapel lingered, it was not as a wound but as a lesson. A vow once spoken carries weight. A heart, once freed, cannot be bound again. And a life, once claimed by fear, can find its strength in the courage to choose. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the land in fire and gold, the girl stood with the wind in her hair, no longer just a daughter, no longer just a bride-to-be, but her own. The storm had passed, but the truth remained, and it would carry her forward into whatever lay ahead.